The door creaked open, not from a knock, but from a figure pushing her way in, shoulders sagging, breath shallow, eyes wide with something wild. She smelled like rain, like blood, like dirt, and for a moment the world outside froze. The outlaw stood there, his hand on the worn edge of the doorframe, boots planted firmly in the dirt as his eyes moved slowly across her. She was soaked through, hair matted to her face, and her hands trembled at her side. He didn't ask why, didn't ask who. I didn't need to. He'd seen too many women like her. Broken, worn thin by things they wouldn't speak of. He knew enough to stay silent. She stepped in without invitation, the weight of the moment pressing against the walls. Her eyes flickered to the kitchen, and he followed the motion, the look in her gaze telling him everything he needed to know. The place was empty, silent, save for the low hum of the wind against the cabin. He shut the door behind her, but still didn't speak. I didn't need to. "Where's your water?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. It cracked like it hadn't seen use in years. He pointed to the stove, where a kettle sat, steam curling upward. "You gonna tell me what happened?" She shook her head, slowly at first, then more firmly, as if trying to shake off the burden of words. "No." The blood on her dress was dark, almost black now, but the stains weren't hers. He could tell. "It's not mine." He didn't move toward her. Instead, he reached for the kettle, his hand steady despite the stillness of the room. She watched him, but she didn't seem to see him. Her eyes were distant, like something was on the other side of her gaze, something darker, more terrifying than what she'd just walked away from. "Sit down," he said, his voice gruff, low. He didn't wait for her to respond. He wasn't asking. He was telling her. The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled too tight. She sat slowly, as if each movement cost her something. He watched her, but he still didn't ask. What was the point? Everyone had their story, their sins to wear. Hers, it seemed, was still soaked into her skin. She placed her hands in her lap, fingers twitching, as if trying to fold them into something they once knew how to do. The outlaw set the kettle down with a clink and turned to face her, leaning against the wall as the silence threatened to spill over. He knew better than to ask the questions that were clawing at him. Where had she come from? Who had she been running from? What had she done? But she answered anyway. "I was at the creek." Her voice was rough, like gravel dragged through dry dirt. She didn't look at him as she spoke. Her eyes stared at the space between her boots. "They followed me. They always do." He didn't need her to say more. He had seen it too many times, the fear in women's eyes, the haunted way they walked after everything was over. Sometimes it was as if they never really came back from whatever they'd been through. He had no sympathy for it, not anymore. He had his own ghosts to carry. "You hurt?" he asked, his voice softer this time. He wasn't used to softness, but it came out anyway, unbidden. "No," she answered, but she was lying. She was lying to herself more than anyone else. She wasn't just hurt, she was broken, and he knew it. She stood up without asking, moving towards the small wooden table where the light from the window stretched across the floor like a shadow. She reached for the lantern, but then her hand faltered, and she pulled it back like the wood burned her. She winced, but didn't say a word. The outlaw studied her, his jaw tight. The thing that had followed her was in the way she moved, the way she held herself together, like a string pulled too tight. "You've been running a long time, haven't you?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. Her laugh came out cracked, forced. It sounded like a broken thing, something that had been buried and dug up again, too late for salvation. "Longer than you've been breathing," she said, her voice shaking as she finally looked him in the eye. Her eyes weren't empty now, but full of something he couldn't name, something raw and unhealed. The outlaw didn't respond. He didn't need to. He had learned long ago that the things people didn't say were the most important. He just nodded once, and the room fell into silence again, the kind that held everything in place but let nothing move. She stood there, trembling, her hand clenching at the hem of her torn dress, her breath hitching as if she might collapse into herself any second. He watched her, but didn't offer to help. He never did, not unless it was necessary. Her eyes caught him for the first time since she entered, a flicker of something dark and pleading in them. It wasn't for him, not really. It was for something else, something much deeper, a request for something only she could give herself. She opened her mouth to say something, but then shut it again. The words weren't there. Not yet. Instead, she turned her back to him, walked to the window, and looked out over the barren land, her face cold and distant. The outlaw could feel the weight of it, the danger she brought with her. But he didn't reach for his gun. Not yet. He didn't need to. He had no questions left to ask. Some things just weren't worth knowing. He turned his back, walked to the stove, and poured the coffee. As the wind howled outside, he knew that what came next would change both of their lives. And maybe, just maybe, this was the last time he'd ever have the choice. The door creaked shut behind her, and the room fell into a heavy silence. The woman stood by the window, her back to him. The blood had dried in places, leaving dark stains on her dress. The outlaw didn't move. He let the silence stretch until it felt like it could snap. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey, the bottle cold against his hand. He didn't offer her a word, didn't ask why. She'd answered enough without speaking. The shotgun on the table between them was a quiet reminder. She didn't sit, didn't touch the drink. She just stood, staring out of the window, her hands trembling by her sides. He watched her for a moment before taking a seat across from her. "You need something to drink?" he asked, breaking the silence with a low growl. Her eyes flickered briefly to the glass, then back to the horizon. "I'm fine." He didn't push it. He drank instead, the warmth of the whiskey settling in his chest. He leaned back, eyes still on her. He could feel the weight of the air between them, heavy with things neither of them wanted to say. "The man who isn't coming back," he said, his voice rough. It wasn't a question, it was a statement, a fact. He already knew the answer. He'd seen too many women like her, running from something too ugly to speak of. She turned slightly, but her gaze stayed distant, focused on something far away. "He came for me," she muttered. Her voice was strained, as though each word cost her something. "Took what he thought he could break me." The outlaw said nothing. His fingers twitched near the shotgun. There were too many questions, but he wasn't asking any of them. There was no point. She'd talk when she was ready, or not at all. "Then what happened?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost dismissive. "I made sure he didn't come back." Her voice cracked just slightly. There was no emotion in it, no pride, just a cold truth. She wasn't looking at him when she said it, but he knew. He could feel the weight of the words. The thing she had done, whatever it was hanging in the room now, thick and suffocating. He didn't react. He took another sip of whiskey, keeping his eyes on her. She had a way of making a person feel like they were standing in the middle of something dangerous, even if they weren't sure what it was yet. She looked at him then, her eyes fierce and empty all at once. "You think I'm running from him?" she asked, almost challenging him. His fingers tightened around his glass. He didn't respond. "I didn't need to." "I'm not," she continued, her voice low, raw. "I'm running from them." She nodded toward the door, the town beyond. "The ones who think they can fix me, the ones who think they know what I need." He set the glass down. "What do you need?" he asked, his voice flat, like he wasn't sure if she had an answer. Her eyes softened for just a second. "I need to be left alone." She let out a sharp breath, as if the words stung her. "But they won't stop chasing me. They think they know how to save me. They think they know everything." The outlaw didn't speak for a moment. He leaned forward, his eyes cold. "And what do you think you need?" She tilted her head, slightly studying him as though she could see something buried deep inside, something he hadn't shown. "I think I need to stop running," she said softly, "but I don't know how." He stood up, crossing the room slowly. His boots creaked against the wooden floor as he walked past her, keeping his distance. There was something in her, something broken but alive, that made him want to turn away. But he didn't. He couldn't. She stared after him as he grabbed his coat from the back of the chair. "You're not going to ask who he was?" she asked, her voice trembling now. "The man I took care of?" He stopped at the door, his hand resting on the handle. He didn't turn to face her. "Doesn't matter," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "No one's ever the same after they're gone." She watched him, a flicker of something in her eyes. Fear, regret, maybe both. But it wasn't enough to stop her from speaking. "I'm not running from him," she repeated, softer this time, as if she was trying to convince herself. "I'm running from them." The outlaw said nothing. He turned the door handle and stepped out into the cold air, leaving her alone in the room, the words she hadn't spoken echoing in the silence. She moved through the cabin with careful steps, as if every creak of the floorboards could give her away. The faint smell of dust and sweat clung to the air, but she didn't mind. It was quiet here, too quiet, the kind of quiet that made you wonder if you were being watched. Her eyes fell on the bed, and for a moment something like comfort flickered in her chest. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She couldn't remember the last time she'd slept in a bed this soft, the last time her back wasn't aching from the cold ground or the hard chair she'd used to rest her bones. She moved toward it, her hands instinctively reaching for the edges of the blanket. But then she froze, her fingers just inches from the fabric. The quilt, the one folded neatly at the foot of the bed. It wasn't just any quilt. She could tell. The colors, faded, worn, seemed familiar. She could almost smell the old woman's scent on it, though she couldn't quite place it. The quilt had been here long before her, and she wasn't sure she was ready to touch it. The outlaw's voice cut through the silence like a whip. "Don't you dare touch that quilt!" She jerked back, a breath catching in her throat. He hadn't moved, hadn't even looked at her, but his voice, it was enough. She didn't need to turn to see the warning in his eyes. Her hand hovered above the quilt, and she fought the urge to ignore his command. She didn't need to be told what to do, but something about his words, the way they cracked in his throat, almost like a prayer, made her hesitate. She didn't say anything, just stood there, her breath shallow as she met his gaze. "You hear me?" he asked, this time with a sharpness that told her it wasn't a request. She nodded slowly, biting her lip, her fingers still hovering just above the fabric. "Why?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. His eyes darkened, and for the first time since she walked through the door, she saw something flicker in him. Fear, maybe, or regret. She couldn't tell. He took a step forward, his boots heavy on the floorboards. "Because it ain't for you," he said, his voice low, rough. "That quilt belongs to someone else. You don't need to go digging around in things you don't understand." She swallowed hard, her throat dry. The room suddenly felt smaller. The walls, the floor, the very air seemed to press in on her. "You don't know what's in that quilt," he added, voice quieter now, though the tension in it was still there. "Don't make the mistake of thinking it's just fabric." She wanted to ask what he meant, wanted to demand answers, to press him for the truth. But the way he was looking at her, the way his eyes flitted between the quilt and her face, told her that this was something she wasn't ready to understand. Instead, she pulled her hand back, taking a step away from the bed. Her heart was pounding in her chest, and her fingers tingled with the memory of the quilt's weight. She felt something cold in her gut, something familiar. "I'm not your enemy," she said, her voice softer than before. It was a confession more than a question. She wasn't sure why she was saying it, but the words felt necessary, like they had to be out there before the silence swallowed her whole. He didn't reply at first, just stood there, staring at the quilt like it was something he could never escape. "You don't know anything about me," he finally muttered, his voice rough and thick with something she couldn't place. "And you don't want to." She swallowed, her mouth dry. "Then why am I here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The outlaw's gaze shifted to the floor, the weight of the room pressing in. He didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge her question, but the air between them grew heavier, thicker. There was a history there, one that neither of them wanted to touch. "You'll leave when you're ready," he said at last, his voice distant, almost resigned. He reached for the bottle of whiskey on the shelf, the sharp clink of glass breaking the stillness. But not today. Not yet. She wanted to ask him why. Why not today? Why not now? But the question died in her throat. She was too tired, too worn, too used to running. Instead, she turned her back to him, her hand reaching for the quilt again. This time, she didn't touch it. She just stood there, watching it. The faint stains, the frayed edges, the patches that looked like they had been sewn on years ago. It wasn't just a quilt. It was a memory, a reminder of something long buried and forgotten. And yet, in this house, with him, it felt alive. The outlaw's voice broke through again. "You're not ready for that quilt," he said, his tone harsh, but there was something underneath it. A desperation, maybe, or something else, something darker. She took a deep breath, nodded, and took a step away from the bed. The quilt would stay where it was for now. The silence stretched out between them again, thick and heavy. She didn't know what he was running from, or why the quilt held so much power over him, but she was starting to understand that some things in this place could never be touched. Some things were meant to stay buried. For now, she stayed quiet, waiting for the moment when the past would rise up to meet them both. The morning light filtered weakly through the grimy window, casting long shadows across the cabin. The quiet was oppressive, thick enough to make it hard to breathe. She stood by the door, her back to the room, her fingers grazing the frame like it might tell her something. Outside, the wind had picked up, but inside, it was dead silent except for the slow creak of the floorboards beneath her feet. She turned toward the door, her gaze falling on the floor in front of it. A boot print, fresh. Its edge was still soft, the dark shape of it standing out against the dust. The wetness of it caught her attention first. The marks weren't old, still damp, still moving like it had just been made. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. She didn't need to see it to know what it meant, but the outlaw did. He hadn't noticed it until she had. Her sharp intake of breath, the way she froze, told him everything he needed to know. His eyes flicked from her to the door and then to the mark. His face went hard, his jaw tightening in a way that said he knew exactly what this meant. "I wasn't expecting company," he muttered, his voice low, almost too quiet. His eyes shifted, darting toward the window, the walls, as if the room itself might betray him. The woman didn't move. She just stood there, watching him, her gaze unwavering. "Sheriffs?" she asked, but it wasn't a question. She already knew. He didn't answer at first, his hand coming up to rub at his neck, like he was trying to relieve some tension that wouldn't go away. He shifted his weight, and his eyes darted toward the window again, his thoughts clearly racing. She took a step forward, closer to the door, her boots making soft echoes on the wooden floor. "What's he doing here?" she asked, her voice hardening. The outlaw didn't respond right away. Instead, he walked to the door, the floorboards groaning under his weight as he reached for the latch. His fingers brushed against it, but he didn't open it. Instead, he turned to face her, his eyes suddenly cold, distant. "Doesn't matter," he said, his tone sharp. "Doesn't matter why he's here." He paused for a beat, his eyes narrowing. "What matters is that he's not welcome." Her gaze flickered toward the door again, her jaw tight. "He's not the only one who isn't welcome." The words hung in the air between them like a threat, like something that could break wide open if they weren't careful. The outlaw didn't flinch. He wasn't scared of her, but the thought of the sheriff out there, that boot print still damp on the floor, made something in him stir, a sense of urgency he couldn't shake. He turned back to the door, his hand still resting on the latch. "Get back from the door," he ordered, his voice suddenly all business. "Now." She didn't argue. Instead, she stepped back, away from the door, watching him carefully. She could feel the tension in the air, thick and sharp. She knew better than to push him right now. His fingers curled around the latch, but then he paused, looking back at her. There was something in his eyes, a flicker of something she couldn't name. Maybe it was fear, or maybe something else. But it was enough to make her heart skip in her chest. "Don't go looking for trouble," he said quietly, his voice almost gentle, a warning buried underneath the calm. "It's not what you think." But she didn't think so. Not yet. She knew enough to keep moving forward, to keep her questions quiet for now. The sheriff was outside, the boot print was still wet, and she wasn't the only one with something to hide. She waited, her body still tense, as he pushed the door open just a crack. The hinges groaned, and the fresh air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of dirt and something else. Something he didn't want to face. For a moment, the two of them stood there, the only sound the wind outside, whispering through the cracks in the walls. Then, the outlaw stepped outside, his eyes scanning the horizon, his movements quick and deliberate. He didn't look back at her. She followed him, her boots clicking softly against the floor as she reached the doorframe. Her eyes swept over the landscape, the wide, empty land that stretched out ahead of them. There was nothing, no one, just the wind, the sky, and the distant sound of something she couldn't name. And then she saw it. In the distance, the sheriff's horse tied up to a post, and standing next to it, his face unreadable, was the man himself. She turned back to the outlaw. He didn't need to say anything. His face told her everything she needed to know. Whatever had been said, whatever deal had been struck, It was over now. The sheriff had found him. The game had changed. The first light of dawn crept into the cabin, weak and pale, casting long shadows across the floor. The wind had died down overnight, leaving a heavy stillness that made everything feel suffocating. She stood at the hearth, her back to him, the fire crackling quietly beneath the rusted iron. Her hands moved with purpose, pulling at the edges of the dress she had been wearing for days, the one she had walked into this place in. The outlaw didn't speak as he watched her. He didn't need to. She was making a choice. He could see it in the way her hands trembled as she took the dress, crumpled it into a ball, and held it over the flames. The fabric caught quickly, the smell of burning cloth filling the room, thick and acrid. She didn't flinch, didn't even look at the fire. Her eyes were focused on something else, something that wasn't here, in this cabin, in this moment. Her past was unraveling before her eyes, each thread turning to ash as the flames swallowed it whole. The outlaw leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on her. He could feel the weight of the silence between them, thick as the smoke rising from the fire. It was the kind of silence that made your skin crawl, that forced you to face the things you'd been running from. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice low but steady. Her fingers tightened around the fabric as it smoldered, the heat from the flames flickering against her skin. She didn't answer immediately. The fire crackled louder, the sound almost deafening in the quiet cabin. "Because I have to," she said, her voice rough, as if the words were something she hadn't spoken in years. "Because this is the last part of it, the last piece of me I can't leave behind." The outlaw didn't reply. He just watched her, his eyes narrowing as the dress burned away to nothing, the ashes rising in the air like ghosts. "You don't have to do this," he said, after a long pause, his voice softer this time, almost like he was trying to convince himself more than her. She glanced over her shoulder at him, her eyes unreadable, and then turned back to the fire. "You think I'm doing it for you?" Her laugh was hollow, bitter. "This isn't for anyone but me." The last of the dress crumbled into ash, the flames dying down as the fabric vanished, leaving only the charred remnants on the hearth. She stood there, watching the embers fade, her face expressionless. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the soft crackling of the dying fire. "Are you done now?" he asked, pushing himself off the wall, his voice sharp with impatience. "You've burned your past. What now?" She didn't respond right away. Her hands were empty now, resting by her sides, her body still and rigid. She didn't need to say it. He could see it in the way she held herself. She wasn't running anymore, not from the past, not from him. Whatever had been buried in that dress, in the ashes, was gone. For a moment, there was a quiet understanding between them, something unspoken but felt in the tension that clung to the air. She had made her choice. She had let the fire consume it all. "You're free now," he said, his voice rougher than before, like the words had to be dragged out. She turned to face him then, her eyes steady, her expression unchanged. "No," she said quietly. "I'm not free. Not yet." The outlaw's brow furrowed. "Then what are you?" She looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing her words, as if deciding just how much to say. "I'm still here," she said at last, her voice low, the weight of the words settling into the space between them. The outlaw stepped toward her, his boots silent on the floor, his movements deliberate. His gaze dropped to the ash on the floor, to the remnants of her past. The smell of it hung in the air like something foul. "You can keep running," he said, his voice low, almost a growl, "but there's nowhere to go, not anymore." She didn't flinch, didn't pull away. Instead, she stepped closer to him, her face hard and set, like she was already prepared for whatever came next. "I'm not running," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I'm just trying to remember how to stand still." The words hit him harder than he expected. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. She was right. She wasn't running anymore. She had burned everything that could have kept her bound to the past, and now she was just waiting for the next thing to come, whatever it was. Her eyes met his then, steady and unflinching, and for a moment, the air between them seemed to shift. There was a weight to it now, a shared understanding that neither of them had been prepared for. The fire was gone. The ashes were all that remained. And in that silence, the outlaw realized that there was nothing left to burn. The room was quiet, save for the soft creaking of the cabin as the wind pressed against the walls. She stood near the table, her hand resting lightly on the edge, eyes scanning the room. The dim light from the small window barely reached into the corners, leaving shadows that clung to the walls like secrets. Her gaze fell on the photo frame sitting on the mantel. It was an old one, faded at the edges, the glass scratched and clouded by time. The woman in the photo looked like she belonged to another world, one long before this cabin, before the fire, and the dust, and the blood. The photo was worn, but the woman's face still held a faint beauty, a softness that seemed to have been lost in the world outside. Her eyes were wide, dark, almost too intense. The woman's features were sharp, her hair dark and pinned back, dressed in a simple gown, her smile a quiet thing, as if she knew some unspoken truth. She didn't look like the outlaw's mother. No, this woman was different. Something in her face was familiar, but she couldn't place it. Something about her eyes, those wide, searching eyes, made her pause. Her heart skipped when she noticed it. The girl in the photo had the same eyes, the same deep-set eyes as her unborn child. The room went still, the air suddenly thick with something that wasn't there before. She reached out, her fingers hovering over the glass, but she didn't touch it. She couldn't. The resemblance was too stark, too impossible. The woman in the photo could have been her. She could have been the same person if time had bent a different way, if fate had decided she wasn't standing here today. The photo pulled her in, its weight settling on her chest like a rock. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. The feeling of recognition gripped her, squeezing the breath out of her lungs. How could this be? How could her child's eyes belong to someone who had died long before she ever existed? The sound of boots on the floor behind her broke the silence, and she stiffened. The outlaw had entered the room without a sound, standing just a few feet away. His presence was like a shadow in the corner of her mind. She didn't turn to face him, her eyes still locked on the photo. "I told you not to touch it," he said, his voice low, rough, the words hanging in the air between them. She didn't respond. She couldn't. Her mind was swirling, turning over the possibility that this woman, this stranger, was somehow tied to everything, to the child she was carrying, to the past she hadn't asked to know. The outlaw's footsteps drew closer, but she still didn't move. His presence pressed in on her, like a stone that wouldn't roll. "You've been quiet," he muttered, almost to himself. "That's never good." She finally turned to face him, her hand still hovering inches from the glass. She couldn't bring herself to touch it, couldn't bring herself to disturb the mystery it held. "Who is she?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. His face tightened, his eyes flicking away, avoiding her gaze. The walls felt even smaller now, the air heavier. He didn't say anything at first, and for a long moment she thought he might not answer. "Someone who doesn't matter anymore," he finally said, his voice colder now. She was never supposed to matter. The words hung in the room, their weight heavier than the silence that followed. She watched him carefully, noting the tightness in his jaw, the way his hands clenched at his sides. He was hiding something. He was always hiding something. Her heart hammered in her chest as she turned back to the photo. The resemblance between the woman and her child was too real to ignore, too sharp. "Her eyes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "My child has her eyes." He shifted uncomfortably, his eyes briefly meeting hers, but then they moved quickly to the floor, avoiding her gaze. "It's not the same," he muttered, but there was a nervousness in his voice that hadn't been there before. "You don't know anything about her." She didn't believe him. She couldn't. The truth was right there, staring her in the face. The woman in the photo was more than just a stranger. She was tied to this place, to this child, to something buried deep beneath the layers of time and regret. She stepped away from the mantel, the photo still burning in her mind. "Then why does it feel like I've seen her before?" she asked, her voice tight with something she couldn't name. "Why does it feel like I'm looking at someone I'm supposed to know?" The outlaw didn't answer. He couldn't. His silence was louder than any words he could have spoken. She could feel it now. The tension between them, the unspoken history that had been buried for far too long. "I'm not asking for your answers," she said, her voice steady but laced with something raw. "But you'll give them to me, sooner or later." He didn't respond. Instead, he turned away, his hand resting on the doorframe, his back to her. He didn't look back. Not this time. The room was still, the photo hanging on the wall, the the woman's eyes following her with a gaze that didn't belong to the past. And as the outlaw's footsteps faded into the distance, she felt it, something old, something buried, stirring beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. The moonlight filtered through the thin curtains, casting faint shadows across the room. The cabin was silent, save for the creak of the wooden floorboards and the distant hum of the wind outside. She lay on the bed, her back turned to him, her breathing slow and steady. He was still awake, though. His mind raced, the events of the past few days gnawing at him like a restless animal. She hadn't spoken much since the photo. She was distant, closed off, but he knew better than to push. There were some things even a man like him couldn't force out of another person. He hadn't asked about the woman in the photo again. The look in her eyes when she'd seen it, the way she'd touched the glass, it had been enough. She'd felt it too. The connection, the weight of something hidden. He shifted in the bed, the covers tangled around his legs, the heat from her body across the room like a constant reminder. There was no getting comfortable with the distance between them, even though they were both in the same space. He tried to ignore it, to push it back, but his mind wouldn't let go. The sheriff, the photo, the child that wasn't his. She shifted in her sleep, and for a moment he thought she was awake, but her breathing remained steady. His eyes lingered on her, on the curve of her body under the thin blanket. It was almost too easy to reach out, to let his hand hover just above her skin. But he didn't move. Not at first. Then, without thinking, his hand slid slowly toward her belly. His fingers brushed lightly against the fabric of her shirt, barely touching her skin. He paused, his breath caught in his throat as the warmth of her body seeped into his fingertips. It wasn't the softness of her skin that made his pulse quicken. It was the life beneath it, the small, steady rhythm of something alive. He felt it then, the small, unmistakable pulse, the flutter of something that was both foreign and familiar. It wasn't just her belly, it wasn't just the child, it was the connection, the bond, that existed between them whether he wanted it or not. The warmth of the life growing inside her was a constant pull on him, like an invisible thread binding him to something he couldn't control. The weight of it pressed against his chest, and suddenly he felt like he couldn't breathe. His hand jerked back as if burned, but it was too late. The feeling had already settled deep into his bones, lodged there, unshakable. He lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what he had just felt. The moment seemed to stretch, pulling him deeper into a place he didn't want to go. He hadn't planned for this. He hadn't planned for any of it. But now, he couldn't push it away. It was too real, too close. And the more he tried to ignore it, the more it tangled around him. The rest of the night passed in a blur. He didn't sleep. Couldn't. Every time his eyes fluttered shut, he saw the child's eyes, those same eyes that had looked back at him from the photo. The woman, the baby. It all felt too tied together, too inescapable. When morning came, the light that filtered through the cracks in the cabin seemed too bright, too harsh. He could feel the sweat on his skin and could taste it in the air. He was shaken, his heart pounding beneath his ribs as if he had just run a mile. But he hadn't. He'd just touched her belly, just felt the life inside her. He sat up in the bed, his head heavy with the weight of the night, and glanced over at her. She was still asleep, her face peaceful, unaware of the storm raging inside him. He could feel the pull of the secret, the heavy silence between them. He stood up, his legs unsteady as he walked to the window, the floorboards creaking beneath his feet. The cabin was still, the world outside bathed in the golden light of the morning sun. He felt like an outsider in it all, like a stranger to the life he had touched. His hand lingered on the window frame, his fingers tight against the wood as he stared out into the empty land. The emptiness stretched out before him, and he couldn't escape it. The child inside her wasn't his. He couldn't claim it, couldn't make it his own. But the feeling in his chest, the pull, the connection was undeniable. It was there, deep in his gut, and it wasn't going away. When she woke up, he didn't say anything. He didn't know how to. The weight of the night, the weight of the truth that had settled in his bones, was too much. He couldn't even look at her. Instead, he walked to the door and opened it, the cool morning air rushing in. The world outside felt too big, too full of things he couldn't control. But for the first time, it felt like the only place he could escape to. He didn't know what he was running from, but he knew it wasn't her. It wasn't the child. It was something inside himself, something that had been buried too long. The sound was faint at first, barely a whisper against the stillness of the cabin. She didn't notice it right away, but he did. The creak of a floorboard above them. Then another, a deliberate step, one after the other. Slow, measured. He froze, his hand halfway to his mug, eyes flicking toward the ceiling. The sound came again, this time louder, as if the person upstairs was walking slowly, carefully. But there was no one there. The room was cold. Too cold for early morning, the chill sinking into his bones. He glanced at her, sitting at the table, her back to him as she stirred something in a pot. She hadn't heard it, not yet. The footsteps continued, his breath caught in his throat. He was used to being quiet, too used to it. But this was something different. He didn't want to believe it, didn't want to give in to the creeping sensation that something was wrong. But the floor above them creaked again, and this time, there was no mistaking it. His eyes snapped to the corner of the room, then back to the stairs. There were no stairs. He shook his head, trying to clear the fog in his mind. He could feel the sweat starting to bead on his forehead, a cold panic gnawing at the edges of his calm exterior. But he didn't move, didn't speak, just wait. The sound was too deliberate, too real. And yet, it wasn't possible. There was nothing upstairs. He knew that. He'd checked the place when they arrived. No attic, no second floor, just this room, a dirt floor, a few walls, nothing else. "You hear that?" he finally asked, his voice low, barely a whisper. She looked up from her cooking, her brow furrowing in confusion. "Hear what?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. He could feel his pulse quickening, his heart hammering in his chest. She was watching him now, the spoon in her hand frozen mid-stir as she waited for him to say something. But he couldn't explain it. Not yet. The footsteps came again, one after another, heavier this time, as if someone was walking directly above him, pacing, shifting. There were no stairs, no lofts, just the empty space above, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. His eyes darted toward the walls, then the shadows in the corners of the room. Something was moving in the dim light, something that wasn't supposed to be there. He stood up, his legs unsteady, as if the floor beneath him might give way. He took a few slow steps toward the wall, his eyes scanning every inch of the ceiling. It was empty. Nothing. No sign of anything unusual. The footsteps stopped abruptly, as if the figure upstairs had paused, waiting for something. Her voice broke through the silence. "What's going on?" He turned to look at her, his face pale. "There's something up there." Her eyes narrowed. "Up where?" He gestured toward the ceiling, his voice shaking now. "There's no upstairs, but—" He stopped himself, swallowing hard, trying to make sense of it. Her face softened, her brow furrowing as she stood up and moved toward him. "You're not making sense." "I'm not crazy," he snapped, his voice sharper than he intended. "I heard it, the footsteps, right above us." She stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she shook her head. "There's nothing above us, Jack. You're hearing things." He wasn't sure if she was trying to reassure him or convince herself. Either way, it didn't help. He could feel it in his gut, the way the air had shifted, the tension that had settled into the walls. He turned back to the spot where the footsteps had come from, his eyes narrowing. The room felt smaller, somehow, suffocating. The shadows on the walls shifted again, though nothing had moved. It was like they were alive, breathing, twisting in unnatural shapes. He felt a chill run up his spine as he stepped back, away from the corner. "I'm not hearing things," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "There's something in this house. And it's not just in my head." Her gaze softened, but there was a hint of doubt in her eyes now. She stepped toward him slowly, as if uncertain of what to say or do. "Jack," she said, her voice quieter now, "there's nothing here but us." He turned to look at her, his face tight, his chest still heavy with fear. Then explain the footsteps. He gestured toward the ceiling again, his voice rising. "Explain the shadows, the feeling that something's been here long before us." She didn't answer. She couldn't. Instead, she stepped back, as if unsure whether to approach or stay away. Her eyes never left his, but her lips pressed into a thin line. The tension between them had thickened, the silence now more suffocating than ever. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the footsteps stopped, the shadows on the walls stilled, and the room fell into a deep, eerie quiet. He exhaled sharply, his body still tense as he watched the walls. The silence stretched long and thick, but it was different now. He wasn't sure what had changed, but he felt it. Something was wrong here. Something had been wrong long before they'd arrived. "I don't know what it is," he said quietly, turning to face her. "But it's here, and I'm not waiting around to find out what it wants." The cabin seemed to close in on them as the air thickened with unspoken dread. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. Not until the sun set, and the night came creeping back in. The cabin was colder than it should have been, the air thick with the weight of waiting. The bed, small and worn, was too still. No creaks of the wood, no sounds of shifting sheets, just silence. She was alone. No one else had come. She had known there would be no help, no warmth beyond what she could provide herself. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her body trembling as each wave of pain rolled through her, deeper than the last. But she didn't scream. She didn't make a sound. The outlaw, standing near the door, didn't move. He couldn't. He watched her, his eyes locked on her face, on the way she clenched her fists and drew in each breath, like she was holding something back, something more than the pain, something darker. The fire in the corner flickered, the light dancing across the room in erratic bursts, casting long shadows that seemed to grow and retreat with each moment. She was breathing harder now, her body moving in rhythm with the contractions, but still no sound, no cries of anguish, no screams for help. Only the sound of her breath, the slow exhale, the steady push against her own body. Her hands gripped the edge of the bed, knuckles white, as her body tensed with the next contraction. She closed her eyes, but she didn't scream. She didn't even whimper. Her lips pressed together, her face tight with concentration. And still, the outlaw could not tear his eyes away. He had seen it before. He had seen women like her, women who had fought for something. Women who had fought against everything life threw at them, against the world, against their own pain. But this was different. This was something else entirely, something too quiet. She reached down with one trembling hand, pulling herself into a sitting position. Her breath came in soft, steady bursts, the room still echoing with nothing but the sound of her. "I don't need you," she said, her voice low and strained, but it wasn't directed at him. It was for herself. Her words felt like a quiet affirmation, like a vow to whatever darkness was in her, waiting. She wasn't asking for help, not from him. He stayed where he was, silent, watching her. There were things in the room that he didn't understand, things that had been left unsaid between them for days, weeks, maybe even longer. But it wasn't time for words now. It was time for something else, something neither of them could control. She shifted, her body pushing against the bed as the next contraction hit, the labor surging through her like an unstoppable tide. Her face twisted in pain, but still no scream. The outlaw could feel the tension in the room, thick and heavy, like a storm waiting to break. He stepped forward, inching closer, but he didn't speak. He couldn't. The child's head began to emerge, the moment so quiet that even the fire seemed to hold its breath. She gasped, her chest heaving, but she didn't cry out. She didn't make a sound as the child finally slipped free, the soft, wet sound of the birth filling the silence like an exhale. For a moment, everything stopped. The room was frozen in time, the weight of the moment pressing down on them both. The outlaw's breath caught in his throat as he watched her, watched the way she reached for the child, cradling it against her chest like it was the only thing that mattered. But it wasn't the silence that stunned him. It wasn't the quiet. It was the eyes, the child's eyes. They were wide open, staring up at her with a familiar gaze, a gaze that was too sharp, too knowing. The outlaw's heart skipped in his chest, and for a moment he thought he might collapse. The child's eyes weren't just eyes. They were hers. They were the same eyes he had seen in the photo, in the woman's face, in the ghost of the past that he couldn't outrun. The room felt colder now, the silence stretching out longer than it should have. The child didn't cry, didn't move, just stared up at her, the deep, dark gaze locking with hers as though they had shared something in another life, in another time. She didn't flinch, didn't pull away. Instead, she held the child closer, the breath catching in her throat. There was a brief flicker of something in her eyes. Fear, maybe, or something else, something too deep for either of them to name. The outlaw's chest tightened, his breath shallow. He wanted to look away, wanted to escape the weight of what he had just witnessed, but he couldn't. His eyes were locked on the child's gaze, on the way it seemed to pierce him through. It wasn't just the child. It was everything. The quiet, the silence, the weight of the past. And it was all coming together in this one moment. She looked up at him then, her face pale but steady. Her lips parted, but she didn't say anything. The outlaw took a step back, his legs unsteady beneath him. The air around him felt thick, the reality of the situation too much to bear. He had seen things in his life, things that could tear a man apart. But this was something he couldn't escape. The child, the eyes, the silence. He didn't know what to say, and he wasn't sure he ever would. And at that moment, all he could do was watch. Watch as she holds the child, as the past and the present collide in the stillness of the room, leaving them both trapped in the weight of something neither of them could outrun. The baby's breath was shallow, its tiny chest rising and falling with the slow rhythm of sleep. She cradled the child carefully, her hands shaking as she adjusted the blanket around it. The room was still, quieter than it had been since they'd arrived. The weight of the night seemed to press down, thick and suffocating. The outlaw stood by the window, his back to them. His fingers were tight against the sill, his knuckles white in the dim light. He could feel the tension in his chest, the air around him too thick, too tight. He couldn't look at them, not yet, but she was looking at the baby now. Her eyes were soft, a flicker of something he couldn't quite place crossing her face. She looked down at the child, then back to him, and for a moment the room seemed to hold its breath. "I don't think it's mine," she said quietly, the words hanging in the air like they didn't belong to her. His jaw tightened, his teeth grinding together. He didn't turn to face her. "Not yet." "What do you mean by that?" The baby shifted in her arms, its small face scrunching as it stirred from its sleep. She looked at it again, her eyes soft and distant, the edges of her mouth curling slightly. "The eyes," she said, her voice shaking. "They're not just like hers. They're like someone else's." The outlaw didn't respond. He didn't want to. He couldn't. Her words echoed in his head, sharp and unrelenting. The eyes. He had seen them before. He knew those eyes. He had seen them in the reflection of his mother's face, in the quiet way she'd looked at him when she thought no one was watching. He felt a shiver run down his spine, cold sweat gathering at his neck. His mother. The one person who had shaped his world, the one person he couldn't escape, even in death. He had always hated her for it, the way she looked at him, the way she looked at the world, as if she saw everything that he couldn't. But these eyes, his mother's eyes, were in the child's face. And the truth, when it hit harder than anything he had ever faced. He turned to look at them then, at her, at the baby. The room was still, the silence pressing down on them like a weight they couldn't shake off. The baby's eyes locked on his for a moment, wide and unblinking, and the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The same dark eyes, the same intensity, the same depth. His chest tightened, and for the first time in a long while, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Fear. The kind that gnawed at your insides, the kind that didn't let go. He took a step forward, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for the chair beside the bed. "That ain't my face," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. He had seen enough of his own reflection to know what he looked like. But the baby, its face wasn't just his. "No," she said softly, her voice catching in her throat. "That's your mama's face. Her eyes." His breath hitched, and his vision blurred for a moment. He had known deep down that the child wasn't just a stranger, that it wasn't just a passing figure in his world, but the eyes, the same ones that had haunted him since he was a child. Those eyes had somehow found their way into this moment, into this child. It felt like a knife twisting in his gut, like a piece of his past had come alive and come back to claim him. He couldn't look at them anymore. The baby, the woman. The weight of it all was too much to carry. He stood there, frozen, as the silence wrapped around them, thick and suffocating. He wasn't sure how long he stood there. Minutes, hours. Maybe it was just a moment, but it felt like eternity. "I can't do this," he said, his voice hoarse, barely audible. His hands were shaking now, his legs unsteady beneath him as he took another step away from the bed. She didn't say anything. She didn't move. She just watched him, her face unreadable, her eyes locked on the baby, as if she too were waiting for something to break. He couldn't take it anymore. He didn't want to feel the weight of it, the weight of her, of the child, of the past he couldn't outrun. "I can't look at her," he said, his words thick, strangled. "I can't. This isn't how it's supposed to be." His voice cracked, and the words were jagged, raw. He turned away, his breath coming faster now, as if the room had suddenly become too small, too confined. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't see. "Jack," she said, her voice soft but steady, like she was trying to reach him. But it was too late. The walls had already closed in. The truth had hit him, and there was no way to escape it. "I didn't ask for this," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I didn't ask for any of it." But the baby's eyes were still there, still staring at him, still watching. And he knew, with a cold certainty, that he could never outrun this. The fire crackled in the corner of the room, the orange glow casting long shadows across the cabin. She sat by the hearth, her hands trembling slightly as she ran the rag over the dirty dishes. The same rag she had used for days, the same task that had kept her busy, but she wasn't really cleaning. She was stalling. He hadn't spoken much since the child's eyes, his mother's eyes, had stared back at him. The silence between them was thick, like the kind that settled after something had been said but not acknowledged. She could feel it too, the weight of what had happened, the weight of what had to come next. Finally, she set the rag down, the dish still in her hands, and looked up at him. His eyes were on the floor, his back to her, but she could feel the tension in his body, the way he clenched his fists at his sides. He hadn't asked any questions since the child had been born, but she could feel the words hanging in the air, thick and suffocating. She couldn't run anymore. She couldn't keep pretending. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before she spoke. "I'm not a maid," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but it felt louder than anything she'd said before. "I never was." The outlaw turned slowly, his expression unreadable. His eyes locked on hers, but he didn't say anything. Not yet. His jaw tightened, like he was waiting for her to explain. The silence stretched between them, thick with expectation, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for the truth to spill. "I'm not who you think I am," she continued, her voice a little stronger now, but still shaky. She took a step toward him, the distance between them feeling too wide, like there was something heavy in the space that neither of them could move. "I'm your blood, your flesh." His eyes flickered with something, confusion, disbelief, maybe even a little anger, but he didn't interrupt her. He just stood there, watching her, waiting. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. The words felt like they were tearing through her, like she was unraveling in front of him. But there was no stopping it now. "I'm your sister." The words hit him like a blow. He staggered back, his breath coming in short gasps, as if the world had just shifted beneath his feet. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "That ain't possible." She nodded, the weight of the truth pressing down on her. "It is. It's the only thing that makes sense." He turned away, his hand gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles white. She could see the muscles in his back twitching, the way his whole body tensed like he was trying to hold himself together. "You don't understand," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't want this either. I didn't want to be here, to be the one who tells you. But the child, it's proof. It's all been leading to this." He didn't answer her right away. His hands were shaking now, his fingers gripping the edge of the table so tightly she thought he might break it. "I don't." He cut himself off, his voice thick with emotion, but there was something else in it now, something deeper. Fear? Regret? "Jack," she whispered, her voice softer now, like she was trying to reach him. "We're connected. We always have been. I don't know how, but I know it's the truth. The child." Her words faltered as she looked down at the baby, still sleeping peacefully in the cradle. "The child is yours, but it's also mine. We share the same blood." He turned then, his face pale, his eyes wide with something he couldn't hide. His breath was shallow, his chest rising and falling like he couldn't catch his air. He stepped toward her, his hands clenched at his sides, his body shaking. "You're lying," he spat, his voice rough, as if the words tasted bitter. "You're trying to twist everything around, trying to make it fit. This doesn't make any damn sense." She shook her head, her chest tight with the weight of it all. "I wish it didn't," she whispered. "But it does. It always has." The outlaw's face twisted with something that looked like pain, like the truth was too much to bear. "Why didn't you tell me?" His voice cracked, and for the first time she saw something in him she hadn't expected: vulnerability. "Why now?" "Because I didn't know how," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I didn't know how to explain everything, to bring you back into this. It wasn't just me, it was all of them. Our mother, our father, they kept everything buried. They made sure you never knew. They made sure I couldn't tell you. And now the truth is here. The child is here. And I'm here." His face twisted in confusion, disbelief, but there was something else in his eyes now, something that had always been there, buried deep beneath the surface. The same emptiness, the same fear. But it wasn't just fear anymore. There was a sadness there, a grief he couldn't escape. "I didn't ask for this," he muttered, his hands shaking as he reached for the chair, his body too stiff to move. "I didn't ask for any of this." She stepped closer, her voice steady now. "Neither did I, but it's ours now. All of it." He looked at her, his eyes dark and full of something she couldn't name. But it wasn't anger. Not anymore. The room was silent, the weight of everything hanging in the air like smoke. The child slept, unaware of the past that had finally come crashing down. But for them, for the outlaw and the woman who was no longer just a maid, the truth had broken through, and they would never be the same again. The room was silent, save for the soft sound of the baby's breathing, steady and calm in the cradle beside the fire. He stood by the window, looking out at the dark horizon, his fingers brushing against the cold glass, as if the world outside could offer him some answer he hadn't already found. But it never did. His gaze moved over the land, the dry earth, the hills that had never given him anything but emptiness. There was no solace to be found in it, no escape from what he had left behind or what had been forced upon him. The baby slept soundly, a quiet innocence he couldn't touch, a purity he could never have known. His mind was heavy, the weight of it pressing down on him like the sky was about to crack open. He didn't want to face it. He didn't want to speak the truth aloud, didn't want to say the words that had been waiting at the edge of his tongue for so long. But he did anyway. "Mercy," he said, his voice low, rough. The sound of it startled even him, like it didn't belong to his mouth. The name felt foreign, a word that came from somewhere far away, from all the things he'd failed to save. "That's what she's called. Mercy." He turned, his eyes lingering on the child, the small face so peaceful, so unaware. The name fits, though. It fit in a way nothing else ever could. Mercy for the things he had done, for the people he couldn't protect, for the past he couldn't outrun. Mercy for the child who had been born into this mess and had no choice but to bear the weight of it all. Her eyes, the same dark eyes, stared up at him with an innocence he couldn't understand. But he saw it, the weight, the unspoken history between them. He couldn't deny it anymore. She was his, but she was hers too. They were bound by something older than both of them, a legacy of silence, of pain, of loss. The past was never truly gone. It was here, in the room, in the child. He stood there, his body tense, watching her. He had never believed in anything, never thought he could save anything. But here she was, Mercy, the one thing he couldn't run from, couldn't ignore, the one thing that had survived everything he had destroyed. The door creaked open, the wind rushing in with a coldness that made his skin crawl. She stood in the doorway, watching him, her eyes tired but steady. She didn't say anything. Neither of them did. He could feel the weight of it, the burden of everything he had hidden, the weight of the house, of the land, of the lives they had ruined, all pressing down on him. The silence was thick, suffocating, but they had made their choices. There was no going back. "Do you think it's too late?" she asked, her voice quiet, barely audible above the sound of the wind. He didn't answer. He couldn't. He didn't know. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them, her eyes never leaving his. She placed her hand on the back of the chair beside him, the movement slow, deliberate. She wasn't afraid. She never had been. "She's not just ours, you know," she said softly. "She's everyone's. Everyone who's ever been here. Everyone who's ever been forgotten." He turned to look at her then, his gaze dark, his breath catching in his chest. "I don't know what to do," he whispered, the words tasting like ashes on his tongue. She didn't respond at first. She just stood there, watching him with a look that felt like the past and the future, all wrapped into one. "You've already done enough," she said finally, her voice steady and strong. The wind howled outside, rattling the window pane, but inside, it was still. The silence between them wasn't cold. It wasn't empty. It was full of everything they had said and everything they hadn't. He turned away, his hand tightening around the back of the chair. His fingers were stiff, but he didn't pull away. He didn't want to leave her alone, didn't want to walk away from the child, from the silence that had settled into everything they were. But he knew what he had to do. The weight of the room felt heavier as he stepped toward the door, the floorboards creaking under his boots. He paused for a moment, looking back at her. She didn't move, didn't say a word. He closed the door behind him, the sound of it clicking shut louder than it should have been. The wind outside seemed to push against him, but he didn't move, didn't turn back. The house was silent now, the walls heavy with the things they had chosen not to speak. He could feel it, the weight of the name, Mercy, the name that would follow them, that would stay with them long after they were gone. And for the first time in his life, he wondered if there could be anything worth saving.